For 7 years, I paid for my sister's medical degree. When she graduated, she took me to court over our grandfather's inheritance. Your only job is to sacrifice. That's your place in this family, she said. During the inheritance hearing, I handed the judge an envelope. The judge simply looked at my sister and burst out laughing. The judge's laugh didn't stop for almost 10 full seconds, and in a courtroom, 10 seconds is an eternity. I counted them without meaning to, an old habit from stakeouts, where you learn to clock time in your body because your phone is face down on the seat beside you, and you can't risk the light. Tessa sat very still while he laughed, her spine so straight it looked like it hurt. Her lawyer, a heavy-set man named Foster who'd spent the last 20 minutes talking about my grandfather's diminished capacity, had gone the color of drywall. Nobody in that room had expected a superior court judge to react to Exhibit B like it was the punchline of a joke he'd been waiting his whole career to hear. "Counsel," Judge Halverson finally said, wiping under one eye with a knuckle. "I've been on this bench 19 years. I have never once had a party's own grandfather anticipate her legal strategy from beyond the grave and rebut it in advance, in writing, notarized." He set the letter down like it might still be warm. "Ms. Mercer's motion to dismiss the contest is granted. Costs to the petitioner." That was Tessa. Petitioner. Costs to Tessa. I didn't smile. I want to be clear about that, because if you've watched enough of these stories unfold online, you expect the winning sister to smirk at the losing one across the gallery rail, some private, ugly little moment of triumph. I didn't have one in me. I felt the way you feel after finally setting down a suitcase you've been carrying so long. Your shoulder forgot what it was like to hang normally at your side. Lighter, but sore in a new place. Marin touched my elbow as we packed up. Marin Osei, my attorney. 13 years doing nothing but contested estates. The kind of lawyer who color codes her binders and has never once raised her voice in a courtroom because she doesn't need volume when she has paper. "That went about as well as it could have gone," she said quietly. "You held 2 more exhibits back. I noticed." "I did. You want to tell me why?" "Because winning the house wasn't the part I actually cared about," I said, and zipped my bag closed over the 2 envelopes still sitting at the bottom of it, unopened, unsubmitted. The house was never going to fix what's wrong with her. I wanted to see what she'd do when she thought it was over. Outside, on the courthouse steps, my mother was waiting. Not for me. I should explain before I go further what I actually do for a living, because I'm a private investigator, tends to conjure an image that isn't quite right. I don't chase cars. I sit in a leased Honda CR-V outside strip malls for 11 hours at a stretch, running a long lens on a workers' comp claimant who says he can't lift his arm above his shoulder, and then watches him restring a guitar at his own open mic night. I pull property records, court dockets, business filings, licensing boards. I find the version of a person that exists on paper, the one that doesn't get to lie to your face, because paper doesn't care if you like it. That's the skill set I turned on my own family, and I didn't do it out of spite. I did it because 7 years of paying Tessa's tuition had taught me something about her that nobody else in our family wanted to see. My sister has never once, in her entire life, encountered a consequence she didn't find a way to redirect onto someone else. When we were 14 and 11, she wrecked our mother's Corolla, learning to drive it without a permit, and told our parents I'd left the keys where she could reach them, which was true, and also completely beside the point, since I was 14 and had no authority over where the keys lived. When she failed organic chemistry the first time in undergrad, she told our parents the professor had it out for pretty girls, and our mother believed her so completely, she wrote the department a letter. When I started paying her tuition in her 2nd year of med school, quietly, out of an emergency fund I'd built specifically for this, because our parents didn't have it and Tessa's loans had maxed out, she told people at parties that she was self-funded, that she'd worked her way through, and I let her, because correcting her in public felt smaller than what I actually wanted, which was for it to eventually matter that it wasn't true. It started mattering the day of Grandpa's funeral, when Tessa wore white to the reception and told our aunt it was an intentional choice, actually, about rebirth. And I watched 3 people nod along like that made any sense at all. There's an earlier one I think about more than any of those, though. The summer I turned 26, Tessa was in her 1st year of med school and called me sobbing at 1 a.m. because she'd rear-ended someone in a hospital parking garage and didn't have insurance current enough to cover it. She'd let it lapse 2 months earlier to save the premium, meaning to catch up once her stipend hit. I paid the other driver out of pocket, $3,400, cash transfer that same night, because I didn't want her to have a claim on her record before she'd even started rotations. She told our parents the next week that I'd insisted on paying, that she'd tried to stop me, and our mother told the story at Thanksgiving as an example of how generous I was, how lucky Tessa was to have a sister like that. I sat at that table and let the story stand, because correcting it would have meant explaining the 1 a.m. call, and some part of me still believed then that protecting her reputation was the same thing as loving her. That's when I opened the file I'd been keeping on my own sister for 2 years, without fully admitting to myself that's what it was. Not a case file, not at first, just a folder on an encrypted drive labeled, half as a joke, receipts, where I started saving screenshots and bank confirmations and the small inconsistencies I noticed and didn't say anything about, the way you start jotting down a partner's contradictions before you're ready to call it what it is. The first strange thing happened 4 days after the courthouse, and on its own, it would have meant nothing. I noticed it only because I still had her listed as an emergency contact on a shared family calendar none of us had bothered to delete. A leftover from the year Grandpa was in and out of the hospital, and somebody needed to know who was picking him up from dialysis. Tessa had logged in to check something on a Tuesday at 6:52 in the morning before her shift. I know because the calendar app pinged me with a sync notification I'd forgotten to turn off. I told myself it was nothing. People check old calendars. Grief makes you sentimental about logistics. Sometimes, you go looking for the last version of a life that still had your person in it. 3 days later, my cousin Priya, who works the front desk at Simmons Regional, where Tessa had just started her intern year, texted me something odd. Random, she wrote. But why was Tessa pulling up your grandpa's old chart on the system last week? He wasn't even her patient. He's not anybody's patient. He's been dead 2 months. My stomach dropped in that specific way it does when a piece of evidence lands before you've built the frame to hold it. I felt it before I understood it. A cold drop behind the sternum. The same feeling I get when a subject I'm surveilling looks directly at my car. I told myself there was probably an explanation. Grief, again. Maybe she wanted to see his old labs. Some morbid closure thing. I've learned, doing this job, that the rationalization always arrives first, and the truth always arrives slower and colder, and the gap between them is where people get hurt. I called Priya back and asked her as casually as I could manage whether hospital systems logged that kind of access. She laughed. Denise would have a stroke if she heard you ask that like it's a maybe. Every single click gets logged. Every chart, every field time-stamped, tied to your badge number. It's the first thing compliance checks when there's a complaint. I didn't have a complaint yet. I had a feeling, and feelings aren't exhibits. I got the complaint 2 weeks later, and it came from somewhere I didn't expect. My mother. She called me on a Thursday night, her voice pitched somewhere between apology and accusation, which had always been her native register with me. Tessa says you've been telling people she stole from Grandpa, she said. She says you're trying to get her fired before she's even finished her intern year. Lena, whatever's between you two, do you understand what that would do to this family? I haven't told anyone anything, Mom. I filed a will contest defense. That's public record. I didn't post it on a billboard. She says a compliance officer called her in. Someone reported her for looking at patient files that weren't hers. She thinks it was you. I sat with the phone against my ear and felt something settle into place that I hadn't put there myself. I hadn't reported anything. I hadn't called Simmons Regional. Whatever Tessa had done, the hospital had caught it on its own, the way Priya said it would. Automatically, without needing me at all. I didn't report her, I said, and it was true. And I could hear, even through the phone, that my mother didn't believe me, because believing me would have meant asking why Tessa had lied about who did. I tried one more time to fix this the way I'd have fixed anything with anyone else, directly, with the person, before it got bigger than it needed to be. I texted Tessa. I heard you're dealing with something at work. I'm not the one who reported you. Whatever's going on, I hope it gets resolved. She didn't respond for 6 hours. When she did, it was one line. You've been building a case against me since Grandpa got sick. Don't pretend this is concern. I put the phone down and didn't pick it back up for the rest of the night. She wasn't wrong about the case. She was wrong about when it started. My Aunt Rosalind hosted a family dinner 2 Sundays later. The kind of standing tradition nobody actually enjoys anymore, but nobody has the nerve to cancel. And I almost didn't go. I went because not going, I knew, would be treated as an admission of something, and I'd spent enough years being the one who left the room quietly while other people got to shape what my absence meant. Tessa didn't come. My mother did, and so did 2 of my father's siblings. And by the time the pot roast came out, the table had organized itself into a version of the story where I was the one under investigation. Uncle Desmond, who hadn't spoken to me directly in 3 years except to ask how my little detective business was going, said without looking up from his plate, "Seems like a strange thing to do to your own sister right when she's starting her career, digging around like that." I didn't dig around in anything at the hospital, I said. The hospital's own compliance office flagged it. I found out the same way you did, because someone else caught it. That's not what Tessa said. I didn't dig around in anything at the hospital, I said. The hospital's own compliance office flagged it. I found out the same way you did, because someone else caught it. That's not what Tessa said. I know it's not, I said, and didn't elaborate, because I could feel the shape of the trap in the question. Anything I offered as proof would sound, at that table, like more digging, more evidence, more of the cold, clinical Lena they'd already decided to be suspicious of. My mother didn't defend me. She also didn't disagree with Desmond. She refilled her wine and asked Rosalind about the rolls, and I sat there chewing food I couldn't taste, understanding for the first time in a very concrete way that I could hand this family 100 documents and it wouldn't matter, because they'd already decided, decades ago, which one of us got the benefit of the doubt by default. I left before dessert. In the car, I called Marin, not because there was anything to file, but because I needed to hear one voice that afternoon that didn't require me to prove myself before it would believe me. "You don't owe that table an explanation," she said. "You owe the court one eventually, and you already gave it. That's the only room where the paper actually counts." I told myself I'd try one more time with my mother directly later that week over the phone, plainly, without any edge in my voice, a genuine, unarmed attempt to reach her before this got any further than it already had. It lasted 4 minutes and ended with her telling me I'd always been the cold one, and I understood, hanging up, that I'd just used my last real attempt at fixing this the old way, the family way, the way where you keep offering the truth quietly and hoping someone eventually chooses to hear it. Denise Okafor called me herself 9 days after that, which surprised me because I hadn't filed anything with the hospital and had no standing to be contacted by their compliance office at all. Denise is the chief privacy officer at Simmons Regional, a role she's held for 6 years after a decade in health system risk management, and when she introduced herself on the phone, her voice had the flat, careful cadence of someone who has delivered a lot of bad news to a lot of people who didn't want to hear it. "I'm calling," she said, "because your name came up in our audit as the family member associated with the chart in question, and our outside counsel advised we notify you before this becomes discoverable in a way that surprises anyone. Your grandfather's medical record was accessed 11 times in the 6 weeks before his death by a user credentialed as Tessa Mercer, intern, internal medicine. She had no treatment relationship with him. He was not her patient at any point. Several of those access events pulled records related to a neurological consult he had 4 years prior for benign positional vertigo, completely unrelated to any diagnosis she would have had legitimate reason to review. Vertigo," I repeated. "He had 2 dizzy spells in 2021, got checked out, and it was nothing," Denise said. "But if you were building a narrative that a man was cognitively compromised and needed a neurologist involved in his care, that's the chart you'd go looking for. It's the only thing in his history that could be twisted to read that way if you pulled it out of context." I sat down on the edge of my bed because my legs had stopped feeling entirely reliable. This was the piece I hadn't had in the courtroom. Tessa hadn't just guessed that a cognitive decline argument might work. She'd gone hunting for the raw material to build it, using a hospital badge she'd been given 11 weeks earlier, on a system that logs everything specifically because people like her exist. "What happens now?" I asked. "That's not really something I can advise you on for your family situation," Denise said. "What I can tell you is what happens on our end. This is a reportable HIPAA violation. We're required to notify the estate, which functionally means you, since you're the executor. We've already suspended her system access pending investigation, and given the scope, our general counsel is required to report this to the state medical board as a standards of conduct issue, separate from anything with the hospital directly. That's not optional on our part. That's federal law." I thanked her. I don't remember what I said after that. I remember standing in my kitchen 40 minutes later, holding a glass of water I hadn't drunk any of, staring at the wall, thinking about the version of Tessa who used to fall asleep on my dorm room floor during finals week because she said my apartment felt safer than her own head, and trying to reconcile her with the version who'd used a dead man's chart as ammunition against the sister who paid for the badge she'd used to open it. I failed to fix anything that night. I didn't call her. I didn't call our mother. I sat with the water going warm in my hand until it was too late to do anything but go to bed and fail to sleep. The forgery I found almost by accident, which is how the worst ones always surface. I was cross-referencing bank statements from Grandpa's final months. A habit, not a plan, the same reflex that makes me check a subject's LinkedIn even when the case is closed. When I noticed a durable power of attorney filed with the county recorder's office 6 weeks before he died, granting financial authority to Tessa, I'd never seen it before. It hadn't come up in probate because a POA dies with the person and isn't part of estate administration, so nobody's obligated to disclose it once the person it covers is gone. I ordered a certified copy. The signature on it didn't sit right with me the second I saw it. Too round in the loops, pressed too hard in the downstrokes. Nothing like the tired, arthritic scrawl Grandpa had signed his checks with for the last 3 years of his life. I told myself I was seeing what I wanted to see. Grief makes forensics unreliable in both directions. Sometimes you want so badly for someone to be guilty that you'll find guilt in a signature that's just shaky because a man was 81 years old. I sent it to Gail Petrosky anyway. Gail is a certified forensic document examiner I've used on 4 insurance cases, court qualified in 2 states, the kind of expert whose reports read like they were written by someone incapable of exaggeration. She had my answer in 9 days. "This is not a natural signature," she told me over the phone, her tone as dry as if she were reading a grocery list. "The pen lifts are wrong. Someone traced the general shape of his signature from an authentic exemplar and then filled in without the tremor consistent with his known handwriting from the same period. I'd testify to that in any courtroom in the country. The notary who'd stamped it, a woman named Carla Boudreau working out of a UPS store told a different detective later that she remembered the appointment, remembered specifically that the man who signed hadn't come in himself. The daughter said her father had trouble with stairs, Carla said. She had power of attorney paperwork already, said it was just a renewal. I notarized based on the ID she presented for him and her own affidavit that she'd witnessed the signature at home. That's allowed in some circumstances. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to. Not the daughter. My mother wasn't the one who'd walked into that UPS store. It was Tessa, using our mother's older expired POA, the real one, from years earlier, granted for a hospital stay and never formally revoked, as her template, her cover story, her plausible deniability if anyone ever asked why she had any authority to be handling the paperwork at all. My hands actually shook putting the report down. Not a figure of speech. I had to set my coffee mug on the counter because I couldn't trust myself to hold it and the papers at the same time, and I stood there in my kitchen at 7 a.m., feeling something that wasn't quite rage yet, more like the moment right before a wave breaks, when the water pulls back from the shore and you understand, with your whole body, what's coming. I tried, one more time, to handle it privately. I called our mother and told her, without accusation, just information. There's a POA on file with a forged signature. It was used to attempt a $58,000 transfer out of Grandpa's brokerage account 11 days before he died. The transfer was flagged and reversed by the brokerage's fraud department before it cleared, and I needed to know if she'd known anything about it. She hung up on me. That was the whole conversation. 22 years of being her daughter and the sound of a dial tone was the entire response I got. I called Detective Raymond Ochoa the next morning. Not my mother again. Not Tessa. Not Marin first this time. Ochoa runs the Financial Crimes and Elder Fraud Unit out of the County Sheriff's Office. 16 years on the force, the last 7 of them dedicated entirely to cases exactly like this one. Families where the exploitation happens in plain sight, dressed up as care. He came to my apartment himself instead of having me come in, which I later learned is standard for elder fraud complainants who are also potential witnesses in an active estate matter. Something about preserving the chain of custody on documents that might otherwise get contaminated by sitting in an evidence locker with less careful hands. I want to be straight with you, Ochoa said, flipping through Gail's report at my kitchen table. Attempted transfers that got caught before they cleared are harder to prosecute than completed theft. DAs like clean losses. But forged notarization on a POA is its own crime regardless of whether the money moved. And combined with what the hospital's already reporting on the records access, you've got a pattern here that's going to be very hard for a defense attorney to wave off as a misunderstanding. What happens to my mother? I asked. It was the question I'd been avoiding out loud. Honestly, depends what we find on the notary trail, and whether your sister used your mother's name without her knowledge or with it. I'm not going to promise you an outcome I don't have yet. I can tell you we'll follow it wherever the paper takes us. He looked up from the file. You did about 80% of my job for me already. Most people who bring me a complaint like this bring me a feeling. You brought me a document examiner's report and a bank's internal fraud log. It's what I do for a living, I said, and he almost smiled. The first almost smile I'd gotten out of anyone in 3 weeks. Dr. Harold Wexler had been Grandpa's primary care physician for 11 years, and he agreed to speak with Ochoa the same week, unprompted by anyone but his own conscience. Once word reached him through the small-town grapevine of specialists who all refer to each other that a cognitive decline narrative had been floated about a patient he'd seen quarterly until the day he died. I wanted on record, Dr. E. Wexler told Ochoa, and later repeated to Marin for the probate file, that Franklin Mercer had a Montreal Cognitive Assessment score of 29 out of 34 months before his death. I have seen men half his age with worse recall. He did his own taxes. He beat me at chess twice a month for a decade, and I am not a man who loses on purpose. Anyone suggesting he lacked capacity either never met him or is lying. Between Dr. Wexler's records, Denise Okafor's audit log, Gail Petrowski's forgery analysis, and Detective Ochoa's fraud file, what had started as my sister's court filing accusing me of manipulating a vulnerable old man had, in the space of 5 weeks, inverted completely into a documented 4-agency case that she had spent the final months of his life building tools to exploit him and had used a hospital credential to gather ammunition after he was already gone. I didn't feel triumphant reading the combined file. I felt something closer to nausea, the specific kind that comes from realizing a person you grew up sharing a bathroom with was capable of this the entire time, and you simply hadn't had the paperwork yet to prove what you already suspected in your body. The peak came on a Wednesday, and it came from Tessa herself, which I hadn't expected. I'd assumed if this broke wide, it would break through official channels first, a letter from the medical board, a call from Ochoa's office. Instead, she showed up at my apartment building at 9:40 at night, buzzed my unit 11 times in a row until I answered, and when I came down, she was standing in the lobby in scrubs, mascara tracked halfway down one cheek, holding her phone out like evidence of her own. The board called me in for a hearing, she said. Friday. 2 days, Lena. They're talking about summary suspension pending investigation. Do you understand what that does to a career before it's even started? Nobody comes back from that. Residency programs don't wait around for people under board review. I know what it does, I said. I've watched it happen to people I've investigated. Then call them off. Whatever you gave them, walk it back. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them Grandpa gave verbal permission. I don't care what you say. You're good at making things sound true. I stood in that lobby with my heart going hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, because some old, tired, 11-years-old part of me wanted, badly, to make this easier for her. The way I'd made everything easier for her since we were kids. Tuition, rent, cover stories, silence. I had roughly 48 hours before that board hearing, and for about 90 seconds, standing under the buzzing fluorescent light of my own lobby, I genuinely didn't know what I was going to do. You forged his signature, I said finally, quiet, because saying it louder wasn't going to make it any more true than it already was. You tried to move $58,000 out of a dying man's account 11 days before he died. You used a badge you got because I paid for the classes that got it for you to go dig through his medical file so you'd have something to wave in a courtroom. I'm not calling anyone off, Tessa. I never called anyone on. This is what happens when you don't have to answer for anything for 30 years and then, all at once, you do. She said something after that I'm not going to repeat here, because it wasn't really about me. It was about the shape of a person cornered for the first time in her life, lashing out at the nearest wall. I let her finish. I didn't fight back. I called building security to walk her out. The same quiet, procedural ending, Terrence-shaped moment I imagine plays out in 100 lobbies a year. Nothing dramatic, just a young woman in scrubs escorted through a glass door into a parking lot, and me standing behind it, not following. I didn't sleep that night either. I lay in bed running the timeline in my head the way I run a surveillance log before I hand it to a client. Clean, chronological, no editorializing, because the facts don't need my help to be damning. Marin filed a supplemental motion in probate the following week, reopening the estate record to enter the forged power of attorney and Gale's report before the court, not to relitigate the will contest. That was already decided, but to formally establish the attempted transfer as an asset the estate was owed an accounting for, since the brokerage's fraud reversal had happened outside the probate process entirely, and technically left a $58,000 question mark hovering over the books. Judge Halverson heard it on a Thursday morning docket, 5 other matters ahead of ours, and when our turn came, he read Gale's report over his glasses with the particular stillness of a man who doesn't like being made a fool of twice by the same family. Foster, Tessa's attorney from the first hearing, wasn't there. She'd retained someone new by then, a public defender turned private attorney named Rojas, who spent most of the 15-minute hearing trying to argue the forgery finding was disputed, a claim that fell apart the moment Halverson asked him whether he had his own document examiner ready to contest Gale's report, and he didn't. I'll enter the finding into the estate record as requested, Halverson said. And Mr. Rojas, you can tell your client that a document examiner qualified in 2 states isn't something a judge in this county is inclined to second guess on your say-so alone. This file gets forwarded to the district attorney's office as a matter of course, given the criminal referral already pending. That's not a probate court decision. That's just paperwork following the facts where they already went. I sat in the gallery and watched Rojas gather his things without looking at me, and I understood that this was the version of an apology this family was ever going to give me. Not spoken, never spoken, just a judge's clerk stamping a date on a form that made the truth official, whether anyone in my family chose to believe it or not. The board hearing happened without me in the room. I wasn't a party to it, only a witness who'd submitted documentation. I heard how it went from Denise, 3 days later, in a tone that had softened slightly from our first call, the way people's voices do once the worst part of their job is behind them. Summary suspension, pending full investigation, she said. The forgery finding from your county's fraud unit is what tipped it. A HIPAA violation on its own sometimes gets a corrective action plan if it's a first offense and there's remorse. Combine it with an active criminal referral for financial elder abuse involving the same patient, and the board doesn't have room to be lenient. She's out of the residency program as of this week. Whether she gets to reapply anywhere ever isn't something I can tell you. That's not really up to us anymore. Ochoa's office referred the forgery and attempted fraud case to the district attorney the following month. I learned, through Marin, who'd learned it through channels of her own, that the DA's office was pursuing it as forgery and attempted exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and that my mother had retained her own attorney, separate from Tessa's, which told me everything I needed to know about how confident she was that their stories still lined up. A reporter for the local paper, a woman named Adayora Bell who covers courts and had picked up the case off the public docket once the criminal referral made it searchable, called me for comment. I gave her exactly what was already public record and nothing more. I've spent a career understanding that the story tells itself yourself once you stop performing your feelings about it for an audience. Her piece ran under a headline that used the words forged and medical board and elder exploitation in the same sentence. And by the following Sunday, my mother had stopped attending the church she'd gone to for 18 years, not because anyone told her to, but because, as my aunt put it to me on the phone, unprompted, nobody could look at her the same way after they read what her daughter did to that man. I didn't gloat. I didn't send the article to anyone. I read it once, alone, at my kitchen table, and then I closed the laptop and made dinner, because that's the strange truth nobody prepares you for about Vindication. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like finally being allowed to put the folder down. It's been 8 months now. Tessa's case is still working its way through the system. Marin tells me these things move slowly, that forgery and financial exploitation charges against a first-time offender with no priors often resolve short of trial. Some mix of restitution, probation, and a permanent mark that follows her every time she tries to get licensed anywhere in this country again. I don't know if she'll ever practice medicine. I used to think I wanted that specific outcome. And now, most days, I just want to stop thinking about her long enough to remember what my own life sounds like without her in it. My mother calls sometimes. I answer about half. She's never apologized, not really. She's offered a few sentences shaped like apologies, the kind with no verb attached to her own hands. I'm sorry this happened to our family, which is not the same thing as I'm sorry I hung up on you when you told me your daughter forged a dying man's signature. I've stopped waiting for the version with the verb in it. I kept the house. I rent out Grandpa's watch to a museum exhibit on local manufacturing history, of all things, because it turned out he'd worked the assembly line that made the movement inside it 50 years before he ever bought one for himself. And I liked the idea of it meaning something to strangers instead of sitting in a drawer meaning nothing to me. I still have the 2 envelopes I never opened in court. I don't need them anymore. Ochoa's file already has copies, but meaning something to strangers instead of sitting in a drawer meaning nothing to me. I still have the 2 envelopes I never opened in court. I don't need them anymore. Ochoa's file already has copies. I keep the originals in a lockbox anyway. The same instinct that's kept me employed for 9 years, not because I think I'll need them, but because I've learned, the hard way, in the family I was born into, that the people who ask you to trust them without proof are usually the ones counting on you never asking for it. I still spend my days on stakeouts most people would find unbearably boring, tailing men who fake injuries and women who fake grief for insurance money, sitting now in a Toyota Camry I actually own outright instead of leasing, and I do it well. And I go home at the end of every one of those days to an apartment nobody in my family has a key to anymore. Grandpa's note is framed on my wall now, the one line the will kept for me, to the one who paid the bills he didn't owe. I used to read it as a thank you. Lately, I read it as something closer to a warning he'd already seen coming, written for the version of me who'd need it most, that the people who let you carry everything will let you carry the blame for putting it down too, and that the only thing that ever protects you from that, in the end, is proof.